Hi, everyone. This is Dr. DeFino from the English department. I wanted to talk about the ways in which we make creative and critical leaps. And one particular gesture toward that, which is to make connections between things that are familiar and things that are unfamiliar. And by things, I mean sometimes objects, sometimes moments in a text that seem out of order or dislocating for whatever reason, but also strange perspectives. A position from which we can observe things that allows us to see things in a non-normative or an outlier position, right? And in order to do that, to illustrate the ways in which we do that, I want to look at something of an outlier artist. He's a British multimedia artist by the name of Graysonperry. I imagine he is not familiar to you, although maybe you've heard of him. He's relatively well known in the UK, at least by contemporary art standards, partly because his work is very provocative and very compelling and it's sort of easy to access for a lot of folks with what he's doing, particularly in the work that is around two subjects in his earlier work, which focuses on childhood trauma and often features his childhood teddy bear, Alan Measles, or his gender identity, which is a split identity. Graysonperry identifies as a cross-dresser and has since the age of 7, and he has a female persona that is Claire, who often presents his work in public. And there's something in the way in which he tells the story of Alan Measles and tells the story of Claire that viewers have found extraordinarily compelling. He's also a figure who's often on television. He's done a series of BBC documentaries during lockdown with his wife. He's run a program called Graysonperry's Art Club, where he brings in celebrities and members of the British public, and they make art together, right? So the idea is to kind of get people thinking about art not as something that is unusual or exceptional or available only to the few, but available to everyone. The other thing that's interesting to me about Graysonperry is that he tends to work in media that at one time would have been highly valued, but isn't really valued that much anymore. For example, printmaking, pottery, which is his primary medium, and a form that we're going to talk about today, which is tapestry. Now, there was a time in the history of Western art when tapestry would have been considered more valuable, more precious than painting, for example, for a number of different reasons that Dr. Carlson, I'm sure, could illustrate better than I could. But it's a form that has sort of fallen away in favor. Perry is interested in these sorts of forms, right? Things that used to have value. Vases, for example, in antiquity would have been considered incredibly valuable objects of art. Now we consider them objects of craft, right? Tapestry is a similar sort of thing. Who the hell makes tapestry anymore? Well, in 2012, Graysonperry toured the UK, sort of investigating the subject of class and taste, and thinking about the ways in which Brits imagine the relationship between those two things. And out of that developed two things. Number one was a documentary series called All the Best. And number two was a series of a narrative series of 6 panels of tapestry called The Vanity of Small Differences. The Vanity of Small Differences tells the story of a tech millionaire by the name of Tim Rakewell, who grows up out of essentially working class conditions, educates himself in computer science, eventually ends up selling an app to Richard Branson and the Virgin Corporation, makes hundreds of millions of dollars from it. And in the very last panel of the series of 6 images, dies in a car accident in what is essentially the midst of a midlife crisis. The basis of Vanity of Small Difference, actually, there are 2 bases of it. One, Dr. Cleary can reflect on, which is a series of 8 panels created by an artist by the name of William Hogarth in the 18th century called A Rake's Progress, which tells the story of Tom Rakewell, a man who comes into an inheritance from his miserly father and almost immediately falls into disrepute as a result of his avaricious behavior. And you can tell just from the titles of the 8 painting series, what happens to him. So it begins with the heir, the levee, which is essentially a royal audience, the orgy, the arrest, the marriage, the gaming house, the prison, and finally the madhouse, which is the image that you see right here. It's the last of the 8 panels. It's a story of someone descending somewhat tragically as a result of their avariciousness, essentially, right? It's about bad behavior and its results. The other source, or sources, I should say, are 16th or 15th century Christian paintings, or paintings of Christian subject with a European origin. So when I say of a Christian subject, I mean of the story of Jesus in particular. So the adoration of Christ at his birth, Jesus's ministry, the agony, the annunciation, and the lamentation, which is what we see here. In fact, this is the source of the last panel in Graysonperry's series. It's a Flemish painting of the 15th century, which I'll talk about in a minute. In other words, the story of the kind of the ascension of Jesus. If Rake's progress is about descent, it's about tragedy, the story of the Christian narrative paintings of the late medieval and early modern period are essentially about the ascendance of Jesus into the Godhead, of Jesus's divinity. So those are the 2 sources for the vanity of small differences. Now, I would ask your instructors to show you a brief video at this time of Graysonperry describing the 6 tapestry panels. I've supplied a link for that, so I'm going to pause for a moment and allow you to have a look at that and listen to Perry's reflections on this in his own words, which are much more exact than I can be. So I want to focus on the last panel, which is titled #Lamentation. And there are a number of things that I want to reflect on here in relation to this sort of notion of the strange and the familiar. I want to start with the familiar. So we have that term lamentation. And then, of course, there's a strange element that's brought to this, which is the hashtag, right? So lamentation is an idea that we sort of associate with a kind of a profound suffering. The best example of this, of course, and this exactly the same subject, is the Pietà of Michelangelo, Pietà, the pity, right? Pity, lamentation, same thing. There's this sort of notion of an elevation here, right? The elevation that comes from the suffering and death of Jesus, the passion of the Christ, that sort of a thing, right? In Perry's version, it becomes a Twitter, a bit of Twitter detritus, essentially, right? The lamentation is reduced in the sense that that hashtag is added to it. Its value is, its currency is reduced. If you look at the subject matter, they're very similar, right? We see a woman comforting a dying or a dead man. In this particular case, this is Tim Rakewell. He's died in a car accident in the last scene. And this nurse has come to essentially comfort him while he's dying, right? She's the Mary figure in this particular story, except that the context is changed fundamentally here, right? So not only do we have a hashtag that suggests that this is just some little bit of a blip of information on a social media feed, we're no longer in the place of the skull where Jesus died, Golgotha, and I'll come back to that in a second because it's really important in understanding what's going on here. We're essentially in a car park somewhere in suburban, who knows where, right? Sunderland or wherever. There's a housing project in the back. There's a McDonald's. There's a BP gas station. We can see the EMTs in the back getting the stretcher out to take the corpse away, et cetera, et cetera. And there's all this sort of crap piled around that's come out of the car as a result of this accident. This is not the site of something sacred. This isn't the Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, in this sort of sacred space. This is a profane space, right? So we see something familiar, but we see it in a strange context. Familiar in the sense that we know this background, but the subject matter seems strange. The death of a person, the lamentation of a person. And the inversion of that is true as well, that when we think of the death of Jesus, for example, which is the source subject for this image, we think of that as happening in a sacred rather than in a profane space. The second thing I would focus on here is the text. And this is really important that I sort of punch up because you can't actually read it very easily on this screen, but embroidered on the bottom of each of these panels is text. And in the last one, hashtag lamentation, there's a particularly rich piece of writing. This is told from the perspective of the nurse that's holding Tim Rakewell's body. And I'm going to read through it briefly here. We were walking home from a night out. These two cars racing each other speed past. Middle-aged men showing off. The red one lost control. That's Tim Rakewell's car, the Ferrari that we see smashed. The driver wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He didn't stand a chance. The female passenger was okay, but catatonic with shock. I'm a nurse. I tried to save the man, but he died in my arms. It was only afterwards that I found out that he was that famous computer guy, Rakewell. All he said to me was, "Mother, all that money," and he dies in the gutter. Compare this to the writing of Hogarth in Rake's Progress in the last panel in the madhouse. And I'm not going to go through this great length, but I just listen to the difference in the language here. Madness, thou chaos of the brain, what art that give pleasure givest and pain, tyranny of fancies, reign, mechanic fancy that can build. There's this sense of tension and drama building here. There's a sense of almost operatic tragedy in this language, right? It's all about elevating the kind of extremist state of the characters here, whereas in hashtag lamentation, it's the description of a pathetic man who's had an accident amidst a midlife crisis, calls out for his mom as he dies and dies pathetically in a gutter. His money can't save him, right? Again, back to this idea of debasement and the strangeness of that, right? That in death, this person who's achieved extraordinary power and success is reduced to kind of not just a corpse, but a sort of ridiculous, bloated, broken figure. Now, again, I want to come back to setting here because it's really important sort of understanding what Perry is after here. When we look at the source image for this particular, for hashtag lamentation, this Flemish painting of the 15th century, we see Jesus being held in the arms of his mother, and there's St. John the Evangelist kneeling before him and standing over them as the patron who paid for the painting, essentially, since the patron always gets to figure into the work. They always get to be witness to the great subject. There's a sense of kind of decorum and balance here. Right? There's an appropriateness in the setting and in the subject, that the tone of pity, the tone of lamentation, this is a painting called Lamentation, fits with the subject, right? Whereas in Perry's version, it seems garish, it seems broken, it seems somewhat off. I want to focus on one particular detail that I think expresses this difference very clearly, and it's one that Perry called up in that video. You'll notice, actually, I don't think you can see it in this frame, but you can see it here. In the Flemish source painting, there's this skull, because of course, the death of Jesus takes place at a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. Since there would be corpses being taken down from crosses all the time, and there'd be bones all around, that sort of a thing. So it's a direct reference to that sort of that moment in the story of Jesus. In Perry's tapestry, the skull is replaced by a cell phone. And Perry calls attention to this in his reflection on this frame. It begs the question, why? And you'll remember in the very first of the frames of the 6 in Vanity of Small Differences, the child, the baby, Tim, is sort of adoring his mother's cell phone, right? So there's a kind of reference back to that moment here. Why is the skull replaced with a cell phone? To what extent do those two things connect to each other? There's familiarity in both of them, right? But there's also strangeness in both of them. Strangeness of the presence of the skull, even in a place called the place of the skull, because skulls always sort of bring out that kind of, the notion of a very complex notion of biology, right? Where, particularly when we're looking at a spiritual subject, can be really problematic. Right? This idea of looking at a skull and sort of reflecting on mortality in a moment that is supposed to be about spiritual transcendence. Even more reductive than that, to a certain extent, is the tech tycoon who dies with a broken cell phone sitting next to him. right? This sort of amulet of power, this object that to a certain extent he and his breed have produced, this magical thing, but which is also just a gadget, essentially, right? So again, we're seeing that sort of connection between something that is familiar to us, but seems really strange in context. Now, in order to sort of reflect on this idea, I want to call up another detail in this last frame here, one that isn't necessarily, it's a large object in the frame, but it isn't necessarily one that you're likely to reflect on. There's a Hello magazine at the feet of the corpse of Tim Rakewell in #lamentation. With a picture of him and his new wife. Hello magazine, by the way, is sort of the British version of People magazine, right? And it says Tim and Amber, exclusive photos of software genius and his new wife. And Amber is the one that's sort of walking catatonically around in the background in the larger frame here, right? It's an interesting object to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, why is it in the car? Second of all, why does it come out of the car, right? That Perry has made very intentionally this object sort of lay there, right? It suggests some level of vanity in this character. And of course, the series of tapestries is called Vanity of Small Differences because it is about how we use objects as a way of kind of defining our status. But those objects are themselves debased. They are our phones, they are our magazines, they are our cars, they are the sort of consumer detritus that we surround ourselves with. This particular object seems significant to me, that Tim identifies some value in himself by being on the cover of what is essentially a trashy magazine. Right? Now, what I'd like you to do in thinking about this series of images, and particularly #lamentation, I'd like you to choose 2 details from any one of the 6 tapestries. A detail that is familiar to you for whatever reason, and another detail, and it may be the same one, by the way, that simply has a strangeness to it, but something that is strange about it. And then use those 2 things, those 2 perspectives, those 2 objects, those 2 moments, those 2 narrative elements, whatever it is that you're thinking of, and describe in a paragraph how you think that those 2 things relate to each other. And I want you to think particularly about how they offer an opportunity to think differently about that subject, right? So you're looking at an image which tells a particular story. You discover an object in it that looks familiar to you, and then another object in it that looks unfamiliar to you. And those 2 things together instruct you in some way on how to read it. And then share that with the class. Thank you.